Hey folks, this is Vince with Dad's Gaming Addiction, and today we're going to take a very quick look at the game Dead Panic. Now this game is for 2 to 6 players, ages 13 and up, and the average play time is between 60 and 90 minutes. Now like Castle Panic, this is a cooperative game, where players are going to be fending off waves of enemies. Only in this case, their adversaries are going to be zombies. Basically, this game tasks players with collecting 3 radio pieces while fending off the undead. And once they have the radio pieces, they can call in an escape van, and those who make it to safety will win the game. Let's just take a quick moment to look at the components and see how it's played. Alright, now I know there's a lot going on here, but I'll just briefly touch on these just to give you a brief feel of what's going on. First of all, I want to touch on these radio pieces. And these are the things that players are going to be trying to collect throughout the game. These will come in via survivor tokens, and I'll explain them in a minute. But players will need to pick these 3 radio pieces up and use an action to call the rescue van, which is this token here. Once that occurs, it will appear along the outskirts of the board, and players will need to get to it in order to survive and win the game. Now, unlike Castle Panic, players will actually be able to pick a character, which helps them define their presence on the board. In Castle Panic, you really didn't have that. You just sort of imagined that you were inside the castle, shooting those ogres and trolls to oblivion. In this case, you actually have a character, and you'll see where they are at all times with these cardboard stands and cutouts. Now, with each cardboard cutout comes a character card, and this character card tells you what each person's special ability is. For example, Sandra, the police officer, once per turn, she may spend 2 bullets with 1 action. Let's see, Maria, another example, you may trade with another player at any distance, whether it is your turn or theirs. So as you can see, there are a number of different characters to choose from. You can go through these before you play and pick the character that best suits your play style. Now also on these cards, you've got the turn order down here to help you keep track of how the game flows, and you've also got the possible actions that you can spend on your turn. And if you've ever played Last Night on Earth, there is an injury tracker here. It looks sort of like the character cards found in Last Night on Earth. Basically, you'll be using these tokens and moving them along the track as your character takes damage. And when they reach this skull here, they'll die and you'll turn into a zombie. Now, speaking of zombies, there's actually 5 different types in the game, and they all behave a little differently. There's actually more in this draw bag, but this is just a brief sample. And if you've ever played Castle Panic, you'll recognize immediately how these work. On a particular token are some numbers. Along the outside, you have like the number 1 and the number 2. This is basically the current health of the creature. It'll always be facing toward the center of the board, allowing you to see what its current health is. And as it takes damage, it'll rotate again toward the center of the board to show its current health. And once it rotates past the 1, it is removed off of the board. And as I mentioned earlier, each zombie moves a little differently. Like the sprinter can move 2 spaces instead of 1. The shambler is really nothing special, it just moves 1 space. This creeper only moves on a die roll of 4 or higher, and so on and so forth. Something new to these tiles that wasn't in Castle Panic, you actually have a melee fight value here. During a melee battle, 2 dice are rolled, and if the player rolls higher than the fight number listed here, they win the battle. If the player ties or rolls under this number, the player loses the battle. So there's actually a combat mechanic on top of the health mechanic shown here. Now, some other tokens worth mentioning. You've got these survivor tokens, and I mentioned these briefly before, but these are placed in the draw bag along with the rest of the zombies. And these are the tokens that players will definitely want to keep an eye on. This is how radio pieces make their way onto the board. What will happen is whenever these guys spawn, they'll make their way toward the cabin. If they make it to the cabin, they'll go ahead and drop a radio piece into the cabin. Now, should they fall or die before they reach the cabin, they'll just simply drop the radio piece where they stand. And like I said earlier, in order for players to win the game, they'll need to collect those 3 radio pieces, so you'll definitely want to keep an eye on these guys as they come up. Some other things worth mentioning, like in Castle Panic you had walls. Well, you've got the same thing here. You've got 6 walls that outline the center of the or that border of the cabin, and these will serve to slow up zombies. Unlike Castle Panic, though, they do not actually cause any sort of damage to the zombie. They just simply serve to slow them down. So one will go along each of the arcs on the board. And through certain cards, they can be rebuilt. Now, to go along with those are these damage tokens. Basically, as these walls take damage, or to simulate that they've taken damage, these will slide right over top like so. A wall that is damaged once still stands, but once it's hit again with this on it, it'll fall and the wall will be removed from the board. Now, just some other things to quickly note. There are 2 decks in this game. One is a cabin deck and one is an event card deck. And the cabin deck is what players will be using to actually fend off the undead. They're all your useful items that'll definitely help players out in regards to ranged and melee combat. Pistols, for example, are ranged weapons. Now, you've got a number of different numbers up here, and I'll try and explain this as best I can. The gold number listed is the amount of ammo that this particular weapon has before it's spent. As players use this item in the game, it rotates the card appropriately to the current ammo count. Once a particular item runs out, it may be used as a melee weapon once before it breaks. Although you do have some other dedicated melee weapons in the game, like fire axes. You have some other ranged weapons like shotguns. Now there's 2 other numbers I didn't mention yet. This number in the upper left-hand corner is the amount of damage that this particular weapon does whenever it does attack or fires. And you've got this number up here in white and blue. This is the range of the weapon, or the number of spaces that it can fire or can reach. Some weapons can reach farther than others, like the rifle is a long-distance weapon and can reach 3 spaces, where the shotgun could only reach 1 space. The event deck is the polar opposite of that. Every turn, an event card will be drawn, and this will trigger the spawning of zombies and some other nasty events. For example, you've got this Oh My God card. Basically, it tasks the players with drawing 6 tokens from the bag and placing 1 token in each arc in the woods as you draw it. So these will serve to spawn zombies on the board and debuff players in various ways by damaging weapons or making them discard cards and so on and so forth. Alright, now as far as the board is concerned, players of Castle Panic should find this somewhat familiar. You've got 3 rings here: woods, clearing, and yard. You've got your cabin in the center, and it's not shown here, but you'll have walls lining the outside. And you've also got numbers along the outside, which assists players in spawning the zombies. Speaking of which, for those of you that have never played Castle Panic, whenever you're tasked with rolling dice to spawn zombies, you'll just simply roll the dice, and whichever number comes up is the location or arc in which you'll spawn the zombies. So in this case, if I rolled a 2, there's a 2 back here, so I would just simply put the zombie token with its highest health value pointing toward the cabin, like so. Alright, now the game is pretty complex, so I'm not going to touch on everything, but I will try and highlight the relevant stuff. For example, when you're setting up the game, the players will go in the center. Players will roll a die to determine what arc they start in. You'll set up the walls, and there's even a wall with a door on it. You want to put that one on arc number 5. As you see, there's a little pathway, and that makes the whole thing make sense. So the wall with the door on it will go here, and you'll have 1 monster token on each of the arcs starting in the woods ring. If you want to make your life easier, the manual does have some variants listed there. For example, you can place these survivor tokens along the outside of the board as well. Normally they're put into the draw bag, but if you do want an easier game, you can include them so that they're on the board right away, and that'll make your play experience a much easier one. Now, in regards to how a typical turn might play out, it's broken up into 5 parts. The first part of a round turn is the perform action step, and basically each player will be allotted 2 action points to use to do various things on the board. Unlike Castle Panic, where each player had their own turn and did their thing and moved the monsters closer to the castle, each player will have the opportunity to spend 2 action points. So this is a good opportunity to talk and discuss with the other teammates how to best use them to serve the group. Now, the second part of a typical round or turn is the draw event card phase. And basically, as mentioned earlier, these cards will spawn zombies and do nasty things to the player. The third part of a turn involves moving the zombies on the board. And as I mentioned earlier, each zombie has particular movement rules. But for the most part, they will do one of 2 things. In terms of priority, they'll move toward a survivor that they see. If they don't see any survivors in their line of sight, they'll move toward the cabin. Now, there is an entire page in the manual dedicated to how the zombies should move depending on certain situations, so you'll definitely want to brush up on that before playing the game. Now, the fourth part of a typical turn is the fight zombies phase. And basically, this only happens when you have a zombie on top of the same location as another player, if they're occupying the same space. In that case, a number of things will happen depending on what kind of weapons the survivor actually has. Ranged and melee weapons, if they have those, they'll be able to actually do damage to the zombie. If they're unarmed, in most cases, all they can do is just push them back a space if they happen to win the battle. If they lose the battle, that's where they'll be given the opportunity to drop the weapon that they're using or accept damage along their tracker. And lastly, you'll have this pass bait token, and this sort of ties in with how zombie movement works. There's a few movement rules in the game that describe how zombies will react in certain situations where they're given a choice between going after 2 different people, and that's where the bait token comes into play. This will be passed around the table to different players and will tell zombies how to behave when certain situations occur. Now, I mentioned earlier that step 1, or the phase 1, involved the performing of actions. And there's actually a number of different actions that players will be able to use during that phase to try and help them win the game. One of the things they can do is they can draw a cabin card from the deck. And as I mentioned earlier, these cabin cards are used to fend off the undead. They can spend an action point to use the cabin cards that they've been picking up. They can move one's adjacent space on the board. They can trade, give, or get 1 card. They can repair 1 crack that might be on the walls. And they can perform a radio or van action. And I'm not going to get too much into that, but assembling radio pieces, calling the rescue van, and so on and so forth costs action points. Now, before I sign off, I just want to quickly mention something I thought was pretty cool. On the back of each character card is a zombie card. If your player or character is unfortunate enough to die during the course of the game, they'll flip their character card over and choose these special abilities and become a zombie. And as I was showing you earlier, these zombie tokens exist to help players keep track of where their zombie character is on the board. But just to briefly go over this, each of the zombies, or these special zombies, they can move up to 2 spaces in any direction on move zombie phases and cannot move from a fight. They can also roll their own dice to fight against characters, so they behave a little differently than regular zombies. What's more, you'll be able to pick some special abilities to give your character zombie some superpowers, like you can do +1 to all rolls, move 1 additional space when on ties, and so on and so forth. And there you have it. That's just a very quick look at the game Dead Panic. I didn't cover all of the rules found in the manual, but this should give you a general idea on how the game looks and plays. You can check out my review at www.dadsgamingaddiction.com, or you can simply click on the link in the below description that'll take you there as well. This is Vince, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.